the Earth is billions of years old, isn't it? No, what if the Earth was actually really created just 6,000 years ago, give or take? What if there really was a worldwide flood about 4,500 years ago? What if all of humanity started over with 8 people about 4,500 years ago? What if the various ethnic groups that we have around the world today all sprang from the Tower of Babel a little over 4,000 years ago, and people being separated from that? If all this is really true, then we need to be willing to accept, number one, the authority of what God's Word says, but then number two, equip ourselves with the evidence for this.
As we explained in the previous video, there's no evidence for any of this because it is not really true. We know that for certain. There's no authority in the sacred fables either, because Genesis and the book of Job and all that are not God's word, but the words of ignorant, bigoted, superstitious primitives who obviously had no idea what they were talking about. And arguments from authority are worthless in science anyway.
There's a couple just small little things I want to share with you just on that particular issue. One of them is, do you know that the radiometric dating methods that tell us the Earth is billions of years old, Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, okay? And the lava flow that hardened into rock becomes igneous rock. Do you know that igneous rock from 1980 was radiometrically dated, potassium-argon dated in Geochron Laboratories in 1996, 16 years later. Geochron Laboratories was the #1 most respected evolutionary radiometric dating laboratory in America. And that rock had just formed 16 years ago. The potassium doesn't start to degrade to argon until the lava hardens into rock. So they're not dating how long it was molten rock underground. They're dating how long ago that lava hardened into rock, how long ago the volcano erupted. That's 16-year-old rock. And the #1 evolutionary radiometric dating laboratory in America dated that 16-year-old rock to be 2.8 million years old. I'm not kidding. I have the documentation for it, okay?
In this case, having the documentation means no more than looking at a web page from Institute for Creation Research. I know because I consulted with Dr. Jonathan Baker, a paleoclimatologist who does radiometric dating, and I asked him to explain what Christian apologist Bob Dutko is not telling you.
You're referring to Dr. Steve Austin from the Institute of Creation Research. He collected the rock and sent it to a commercial lab, but made no attempt to perform the standard quality control checks. For example, did the minerals contain volcanic glass impurities or xenocrysts or chemical zoning? We'll never know. These are important because the age we get from radiometric dating estimates the time at which the mineral became isotopically closed, meaning the time when isotope ratios could change only due to radioactivity. That may or may not be the same age of the rock itself. For an eruption like Mount St. Helens, it's almost guaranteed that a fraction of erupted material will be xenocrysts. These are tiny bits of mineral within the melt that formed, well, any time in the past. So if you don't separate them prior to analysis, you will get an age that doesn't reflect the age of the rock itself, because you're not only dating the lava flow. It's no coincidence that the age of each mineral in Austin's data correlates with its melting point. But Austin wasn't interested in testing the method. He intentionally sent his samples to a lab that lacked the instrumentation necessary to detect those ultra-low concentrations of argon that you'd expect in newly formed minerals. More importantly, they performed only the standard outdated potassium-argon dating method, which cannot correct for excess argon that might have been trapped in rapidly cooling volcanic glass. The newer argon-argon method does, so why didn't he use that?
As a matter of fact, every single time rock was recently formed, and we know when it was formed, it also radiometrically dates to be millions and billions of years old. Every time, without exception. Most people don't know that.
No, it happens when creationists set out to deceive their audience by spending tax-free donation dollars on shoddy lab work.
Hey everyone, I'm John Baker. I'm a paleoclimatologist who works with dating rocks and interpreting past climate change to study the Earth, and I'm glad to comment on more mistakes about radiometric dating, among other things. So it's been a while since I've been here and glad to be back. We start off here with the oft-repeated claim about Mount St. Helens somehow giving us these false ages. of rocks that we know the age of. So there's this discrepancy between the known age and the radiometric age. He makes a number of claims that are kind of strange. First of all, this was not a lava flow that was dated. The volcano erupted in 1980, and what was dated by Steve Austin and the Institute for Creation Research was part of a lava dome. So coming out of the crater kind of created this dome. It's not like it flowed down the mountain or something, and that hardened, or it solidified over at least 6 years. And during these 6 years, that lava was very well studied. It was studied petrographically under the microscope, and they could see just like how fast these crystals were growing and things like that. It's very interesting. I didn't know about this, I must say, until recently, even though I'd known about like the creationist claim for, since the 1990s. But the idea here is like we know this happened in the 1980s, and just a few years later, it was dated, and according to our speaker here, it gave an age of 2.8 million years. Now, I've made a video in detailing what happened with those analyses and what the results were. We have to be specific here. It's not like the rock gave an age of 2.8 million years. It didn't. In fact, according to Steve Austin's analysis of this rock, the results he got back, the whole rock samples were indistinguishable from 0 years old. I mean, they detected basically no argon in there. And the only time they got, relatively higher ages was looking specifically at feldspar grains and pyroxene grains that they had separated from the rest of the rock. And he showed thin sections under the microscope of this mineral collection. And these grains were quite large. I mean, they were large enough that they couldn't have grown over that 6-year period from 1980 to 1986. Right. And so part of what's being dated is material that existed and was, had solidified well before the eruption itself. That's something you want to avoid if you're dating young volcanics. It helps to know, because the rock is not just a homogeneous thing. It's a collection of minerals of different sizes and ages and geochemical properties. So the only time you got high ages were on these larger crystals of feldspar and pyroxene that form at relatively high temperatures. These are the minerals that form first as magma can solidify, and very likely contain fragments of older mineral. And that very well could have been the age of the rock. Again, I detailed before, or previously, we talked about why even those ages are not inconsistent with the known age of the eruption. And that's because they start off with this ratio of radiogenic argon that's been produced by radioactive decay. There's a little bit more to start with than you find in the typical atmospheric ratio. So that's something that we can measure and account for if we're using the proper dating method. You would use what's called the argon-argon technique and an isochron method to determine what that ratio was at time 0. Instead, Austin used a method where you simply assume it to be one value. And they always go off about the assumptions we're making and never checking, which is untrue. But here they're doing exactly the same thing. Made an assumption, which we know to be false, because rocks of Mount St. Helens have been analyzed pretty extensively through the argon-argon method and monitored and found to have values that were slightly above this atmospheric ratio of 295. So in fact, these ages are the data that Austin got are not inconsistent with the known age of the eruption. And he's kind of cherry picking this one value of 2.8 million years that they got on a group of pyroxene crystals, right? Which we know to have formed first and probably contain some really old material in them. He makes a few other weird claims, like as though the potassium doesn't start decaying until the rock solidifies, and that's just not how it works. That decay is happening all the time. However, the argon that is produced during radioactive decay, if you're in a high temperature magma chamber, that's not necessarily staying inside the mineral. It's able to diffuse out until that mineral reaches a certain temperature, what we call the closure temperature. That's the point at which it can physically retain the argon, this noble gas, and keep it from leaving, right? So that's when the clock really starts, according to radiometric dating. That closure temperature is much higher for the pelagic clays and pyroxene than some of the other minerals that you would date if you really want to know the age of a young volcanic rock. If we didn't know this erupted in 1980, we wouldn't date large pyroxene crystals simply because they can retain a little bit more of that argon early on, right? So I mean, what the example he's given is a very poor one if you want to show that radiometric dating has problems. I mean, we've got plenty of problems that we continue to research, and I can give you many examples of where something didn't work out quite right, right? And this is by far the minority of analyses, but it can happen, and I can give much better examples than he gives. So it's unfortunate that this claim just gets repeated again and again and again, but encourage everyone to follow up and look at those details. In fact, even the Institute for Creation Research's data are consistent with the known age of the eruption. On top of that, it has been dated, not this 1980 eruption, but the previous lava flows from over the many, many thousands of years history of Mount St. Helens erupting again and again. It is a stratovolcano, so it's covered, its flanks are covered with older eruptions. And those older eruptions down just a few meters go back 4, 5, 6,000 years, right? And so those ages are in order, and they're what you might expect them to be given the recurrence interval of this volcano, just how often it erupts through time. So yeah, we have plenty of examples, even at Mount St. Helens, of material that's dated and consistent with the local geologic history. Right? This volcano's been there for quite some time.
The number one evolutionary radiometric dating laboratory was the Geochron. At the time, that was the number one Geochron laboratories.
Yeah, so this is a very strange claim. He suggests that Geochron Laboratories was the number one place to get this dated in the country, and specifically the number one evolutionary lab.
I didn't
whatever
know there
that
was an
means.
evolutionary radiometric dating lab.
It's I mean, is there really an alternative? I mean, why didn't they just date it in El Cajon, California, at the Institute for Creation Research and use one of their own labs? I mean, they don't have one, right? And nobody who knows how to run them. That aside, like this was a commercial laboratory, and it's not that they have poor results or analyses, but the method that they used for this potassium argon dating, it is strictly inapplicable to rocks that are very young. And by very young, I mean, less than a few million years old. And the reason for that is to determine the relative amounts of argon and potassium isotopes, they have to spike the sample with a known amount of these isotopes. And then they run it on their mass spectrometer, and they do some math to back out how much was originally in the sample. The problem is if the ratio of these argon isotopes is the same or close to the same as the atmosphere, this spiking method leaves a huge error bar on the uncertainty when you back that out of the calculation. So you can't really tell the difference between something that's 0 years old, 10 years old, and even 6,000 years old by this method. So it's just not applicable to the samples they were using. There were plenty of other labs in the country and across the world that you could find that had excellent track records on dating young volcanics, including historically constrained volcanic eruptions, from Mount Vesuvius to, oh gosh, I don't know the name, a few others like over the last 3,000 years, right? And so they were consistently getting accurate results that matched the historical record, using a technique that's more appropriate to that and doesn't involve these uncertainties. And Geochron was like, it's just it's a commercial laboratory. You would go and pay, especially if you were something like the USGS. You weren't a researcher at Stanford or a volcanologist in New Mexico that could actually use one of their argon labs with really fancy equipment. You just send it off for some money and you get some results back. So it's not that it was a bad lab, but to call it like the number one lab is just so far from reality that you could tell he's just has no idea what he's talking about here.
Well, we got one more that I knew you would appreciate, having talked to you about this a number of times. He says, every rock that formed recently, that we know the age of that rock, every single one of them radiometrically dates to millions and billions of years old.
Mhm.
And then he goes on to say, every time, without exception.
Yeah. I mean, you just can't say that. You couldn't say that in the 1960s. And one of their common references is to Brent Dalrymple's pioneering studies, where he would go and date volcanoes and eruptions of known age, that were less than 200 years old. So somebody saw it erupt. We know how old that rock is. And in the majority of cases, he got ages that were essentially 0 years old. I mean, they were indistinguishable from zero within air
Wait, you
bar.
mean there are exceptions?
Oh,
It's not
there's so many exceptions.
every time?
And he found a number of volcanoes that didn't have this. I mean, they contained excess argon, as we call it, excess radiogenic argon. And he documented why that can happen, where it can happen, by how much, and it would inflate the age by a few 100,000 years, a few million years. That sounds like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, when you're dating stuff that's 500 million years old, that's not even an error bar. So it would affect very young rocks if you don't know the age. It would not affect very old rocks. But the thing is, they documented that can happen and why, and we improve the techniques so that we can identify how much excess argon, if any, was present when the minerals formed, right? And so going through the 70s and 80s, when that technique was more or less perfected, and then in recent decades, when we have technology to make it even more precise, and we have countless examples of historically constrained volcanoes that are dated, including tephras throughout the ice cores. These are the ice cores themselves will contain little bits of ash, and then we can date those bits of ash by various methods, not just in the ice cores, but also in marine cores and sediments. That ash gets trapped in the layers, and so we can use that to date the layers. But a lot of these are known eruptions. We can geochemically fingerprint them and tie them to eruptions in Iceland or in Alaska or even in the Mediterranean region, right? So, I mean, the exception to the rule is when you get what he's trying to suggest, rocks of known age that give inflated ages, right? I mean, especially today, that's just a rare exception.